come.
Saving money on heat, man?
I'm telling you, it's cold in here, isn't it? Feel that chill?
It's the chill of excitement about HR 1.
It is. I felt it a little cool myself. Good morning, everyone. It's pretty exciting to be here to celebrate democracy. That's what this legislation is about. And so we have Democrats from both sides of the Capitol to accelerate the fight to put people first, to put power back into the hands of the people. Of course, it's always a privilege to welcome back the distinguished Democratic leader of the Senate, our former colleague for many years, Chuck Schumer, but also to welcome back Senator Tom Udall, a member that we're very proud of from the House, and Debbie Stabenow. Debbie Stabenow, when she was a member of the House, she would have the strongest message of her position with the biggest smile, and we thought, why can't we all be that way?
Has stayed true in the Senate.
and then, of course, Senator Merkley.
A non-House member.
A non-House member, but nonetheless.
But Speaker of his state legislature.
So, distinguished legislator.
So he's a speaker.
Thank you. He knows of what he speaks. And for our side, on the House side, we're so proud of the work of Paul's son, John Sarbanes. He is the godfather of this legislation. He is the chair of our Democratic Reform Task Force and just our spiritual leader of HR 1. And what was exciting about it is it really caught fire with our freshmen. They were our red to blue at the time, our candidates. 100 candidates sent me a letter saying HR 1 should be the first order of business. And 2 of them are with us today. Our leader in the freshman class, Colin Allred of Texas, and okay, is that a Texas call? And Sharice Davids, we're so proud of her as one of the two in our class, are the 2 first women, both first women from Indian country to be in the Congress and the House of Representatives. But all that we talk about in terms of our members and the work they did, that inside maneuvering is essential to our success, but nothing more essential than the outside mobilization. So we thank all of the groups who are here with us today. Your outside mobilization, ongoing outside mobilization, is so essential to our success. So in the Constitution, in our preamble, it says, "We the people," and our agenda is for the people. For the people, we took out the specter of dark special interest money in politics, which suffocates the airwaves and therefore suppresses the vote. We voted to end voter suppression and foreign interference in our elections. Just this morning, it was reported that Russians are accelerating their election interference in order to cause disarray here, focusing on white supremacist groups and the rest. So all the more need to pass HR 1 and to clean up corruption and return integrity to Washington. Again, that will enable us and gives people confidence that with their voice as important as anyone else's as big dark money, that we can lower the cost of health care by lowering the cost of prescription drugs, bigger paychecks, and building the infrastructure of America in a green way, because we are HR 1 for the people. And Senator McConnell, we'd hope that he would pass this legislation in friendship. We have sent it to him. He has said the problem is not that there's too much money in politics, but not enough money in politics. He's proud of that statement. We believe that America needs a government of the many, not a government of the money. And with that, I'm pleased to yield to the distinguished Democratic leader of the Senate, Chuck Schumer. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Speaker Pelosi, and thank you for your leadership on this and so many other things so important to America. I want to welcome my colleagues, Senator Udall, Stabenow, and Merkley, as well as my friends from the House side, Congress members Sarbanes and Davids and Allred. And I'm glad to be here. And I must echo the Speaker. We need HR 1 in order to make this a more perfect union. As a country, we need it desperately. The evidence is all around us. Every single election year, big corporations, big special interests overwhelm the political process with dark money. Just look at the White House. Right down the street, we have an administration whose very hallmark is its corruption. We have a president who hides his tax returns, whose personal finance and business interests are dark and tangled, and who for years has benefited from a system that rewards the ultra-rich. It comes as no surprise that some of the very corporations seeking to sway our political processes that enjoy undue, unabated influence in our elections are now enjoying huge tax breaks thanks to the Trump GOP tax bill. And I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge Senator Klobuchar. She's ranking member of the Rules Committee. She's done great work on a whole lot of H.R. 1, but there's so many issues that face us with this administration. So she is now at the Senate Rules Committee, where they're holding a confirmation hearing for a nominee to the Federal Election Commission who has expressed skepticism about even the most basic regulations requiring disclosure. It's unbelievable. So that's why she couldn't be here. So the special interests are gaining even a greater influence in our government due to not just their financial ability to influence things, but the pernicious acts of voter suppression that stifle the voices of voters of color and young voters and the poor. Only a week ago, just days before the anniversary of Bloody Sunday, Americans endured hours-long waits, standing in lines as far as the eye can see. They stood in quiet dignity. They waited, even though they wanted to get home, maybe serve dinner, maybe watch a favorite TV show, but they stood in quiet dignity doing their duty. But it was hours for some of them. That wasn't by accident. That wasn't by accident. And so I can tell you what I know. The American people are fed up. We are fed up. We need big systemic fixes, and we need them now. And that's what H.R. 1 would do. It would end the corruption, tear down the barriers to voting, and close the gaps in our election security. It would drain the deep, dark swamp made so much the worse in Donald Trump's administration. But Leader McConnell, as the Speaker correctly mentioned, has shown no interest in fixing corruption that's rotting from the inside out. Leader McConnell called H.R. 1 a power grab. You know what? For once, he's right. It grabs the power away from the big corporations and puts it back in the hands of hardworking Americans. For Mitch McConnell, the legislative Grim Reaper, that's a nightmare. People power is his nightmare. And as usual, he didn't offer a single alternative. He just buried the bill in his legislative graveyard. So H.R. 1, it's about restoring our democracy, fixing what's broken. The American people demand it. Leader McConnell must bring this urgent legislation up for a vote now. And now we have, as I think the Speaker said, the heart and soul, something of H.R. 1.
Oh, yes, the Godfather.
The Godfather. Now, it's sort of like heart and soul. Congressman Sarbanes.
Thank you, Senator Schumer, on all our colleagues from the Senate side. So this is an important occasion to mark the one-year anniversary of the passage of H.R. 1, the For the People Act, which was a transformative anti-corruption and clean elections bill. But sadly, it also marks a whole year that Mitch McConnell has held this bill up on the Senate side, along with many, many other pieces of good legislation. But this is the first one. This is at the bottom of the pile, because we sent it first, and he refuses to bring it to the Senate floor. In doing so, he's not just frustrating the will of the House of Representatives that passed this last year. He's frustrating the will of the American people, because it is extremely clear, if you look at all the polling, that the core elements of H.R. 1 are things that the people have a deep appetite for, whether they are Republicans, Democrats, or independents. They want to see these changes. They want to fix voting. They want to fix gerrymandering. They want to fix ethics. They want to protect the ballot box and protect us from foreign interference and disinformation. And they want to push back against the influence of big money and special interests. They want a system of funding campaigns that's based on matching funds, that's actually paid for with a surcharge on high-end tax cheats and industry lawbreakers. Because the people that are breaking our democracy by leaning on it with their lobbyists and their campaign contributions should be the ones that pay to fix the democracy. Now, we know that McConnell's standing against the will of the American people because we see those polls. We know that he is standing with his arms folded at the gates of the democracy, saying to the American people, you shall not pass. We know it from the polling, but we know it more importantly from the class that came in 2018. Because all across this country, reformers ran on the message of fighting corruption and fixing democracy. And they said, they pledged that the first thing they would do if they got here is to get this onto the floor and pass it. And they followed through on that promise. And it is McConnell who is standing in the way of us delivering completely on the promise to the American people that we will lift up their voices, that no longer will they be left out and locked out of their own democracy, which is why we're going to hear in a moment from two members of that freshman class who carried that banner in here, followed through on that promise, and have brought us to this point where we can continue the fight and to say to McConnell, please do the right thing. On the Senate side, one of the leaders of this effort, the person who introduced the companion bill, pulled his colleagues together in support of H.R. 1 and has been a leader on reform from day one. Is Senator Udall, and it's my pleasure to turn it over to him now.
Thank you. Thanks. You want some water? Oh, okay. Congressman Sarbanes, thank you so much today. And it's a real pleasure to be joined by all of these distinguished elected leaders behind me and with the leaders of the reform movement that have done so much on reform. Thank you. It's nice to be here on the House side of the Capitol, where Speaker Pelosi, you're actually getting things done for the American people, and you should be saluted for that. Unlike in the Republican Senate, where Mitch McConnell has dug a legislative graveyard. The very first bill that Leader McConnell buried in his legislative graveyard was the For the People Act. Before I even introduced it in the Senate, Senator McConnell proudly told his friends on K Street, the folks who really call the shots in his Senate, that he wouldn't let us vote on the bill. The truth is this: the reason we have a legislative graveyard at all is because we haven't passed the For the People Act. Lowering the cost of prescription drugs, fighting climate change, ending gun violence, all of these things are widely supported by the American people, and yet nothing gets done because we have a Senate that does not answer to the American people. It answers to the big money, to the lobbyists, and the special interests. And people all across this country have their voices and their votes stifled. Here's why democracy reform must be our top priority. In the year since the House passed H.R. 1, tens of millions of dollars were spent to influence the policymaking process. Nearly half a dozen states passed new voter suppression laws. The Supreme Court gave the green light to political gerrymandering, and President Trump funneled millions in taxpayer dollars into his own private clubs. And meanwhile, in the year that the For the People Act has been buried in the graveyard, catastrophic wildfires in the West, a consequence of climate change, caused widespread devastation. The number of Americans without health insurance has increased by hundreds of thousands, and 22 people were gunned down at a El Paso Walmart. Sadly, just a fraction of the thousands of gun-related deaths in our country. These are the real world consequences when we have a government that doesn't answer to the people. It's long past time that we pass the For the People Act and give the power back to the people. And with that, let me turn this over to Congresswoman Sharice Davids from Kansas. Sharice?
Thank you, Senator Udall. Thank you all to all the organizations that have been fighting so hard for this for so long for being here today. And thank you to my colleagues who are here today and to the speaker for holding this press conference to mark a full year that Mitch McConnell's failed to bring this important bill for a vote on the Senate floor. When I ran for Congress in 2018, I heard from people all over Kansas's 3rd District who were ready for change, ready for real change here in Washington, D.C. They're tired of business as usual out here, tired of representatives putting special interests ahead of the interests of the people. We heard that from communities across the country. We heard that from communities across the country. We're ready for change. It's why the freshman class ran on a platform of reform and pushed for this to be the very first thing that we did when we got here to Congress. We made it clear that we need to root out corruption and restore the people's faith in our government so we can tackle the biggest challenges of our day. As newly sworn in members, we delivered on the promise that we made while we were running. We passed the For the People Act within the first 100 days that we were here. With this bill, we help prevent special interests from spending unlimited amounts of money in our elections. We strengthen ethics laws for members of Congress. We limit the influence of corporate money in politics, all very important things so we can start to get to the root of some of our country's biggest ills. We need to do this so that we can strengthen our public schools. We can invest more in roads and bridges and help move toward a thriving economy. We need to lower the cost of health care and prescription drugs because we know that is something that's too many people are suffering because of the high prescription drug costs. For the last year, though, Senator Mitch McConnell has refused to bring the For the People Act to the Senate floor for a vote. He's decided to side with special interests instead of with the people of this country. Our constituents, the people across our country, made it clear in 2018 that they want leaders who are going to reject corruption in Washington so we can return the power to the people. We need to get the special interests out of our elections. It doesn't matter which political party you belong to, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican or an independent. Your voice should be more important than that of the special interests. There's no reason that this should be a partisan issue. This new class of leaders that has come in to help support the folks who've been working on this for a while are here to say, Mitch McConnell, we are breathing life back into the anti-corruption bill that you have refused to bring to the floor. Senator McConnell, please make sure that the special interests do not outweigh the people of our country. Thank you. Sorry, Senator Murphy.
Thank you so much. A full year in which the key bill for taking on corruption in our government has been buried in the Senate. This is beyond unacceptable, and that's why we're here today to protest the dysfunction of the Senate, which is in turn feeding the corruption. If you believe that we need to end the price gouging of Americans on pharmaceutical drugs, we need to end the corruption. If you believe that every child deserves a quality K-12 education and should be able to go to college without a mountain of debt, we need to end the corruption. If you believe Americans should be living in homes and apartments, not in tents or sleeping on the street, we need to end the corruption. It was Jefferson who said that the test of our new government is whether it produces laws that reflect the will of the people. Well, we're certainly not producing laws in the Senate that reflect the will of the people. Some nearly 400 laws now that the House has sent us on health care and housing and education and infrastructure and jobs and equality and on taking on carbon pollution have died in the Senate. And we will continue to lose on these issues if we don't restore the integrity of the U.S. government. So first, this bill takes on gerrymandering. The people should choose their politicians, not the other way around. And then it proceeds to take on the massive voter suppression and intimidation that has haunted our nation and is expanding ever since the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act. and then it takes on the dark money, the flood of dark money that is like a stadium sound system drowning out the voice of the people. We have all taken an oath to the vision of our Constitution, the we the people vision of our Constitution that is being destroyed by this corruption, and that's why there is nothing more important than insisting that this bill be debated and passed, resurrected out of Mitch McConnell's graveyard. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Representative Allred.
Well, I want to thank my colleagues, I want to thank the speaker, and thank the activists who are here today for fighting for this legislation that will rein in special interests and return power to everyday people whose voices, as we've said, are being drowned out by unlimited dark money. Not only does H.R. 1 take on special interests, it makes voting easier and accessible. Before I came to Congress, I was a voting rights attorney, and this is important to me. In my home state of Texas, we recently saw people waiting up to 7 hours to vote in the March 3rd primary. This is unacceptable and should not happen in our country. H.R. 1 makes voting easier. Among many other things, it requires states to allow online registration and the ability to register on Election Day. It makes it easier for citizens to vote by mail and requires at least 15 days of consecutive early voting. But now, a year after H.R. 1's passage, the bill is still stuck in the Senate. Mitch McConnell has refused to allow H.R. 1 to come to a vote, and hundreds of House-passed bills like it that would address Americans' top concerns, like lowering the cost of prescription drugs, equal pay, and bipartisan background checks. Taking on the skyrocketing cost of prescription drugs is a perfect example. Last December, I joined with my colleagues to pass the Lower Drug Costs Now Act that will allow the Department of Health and Human Services to negotiate drug prices directly with pharmaceutical companies, making those lower drug prices available to all Americans. The fact is, special interests have too much power, which makes it harder for us to face crises like this and like the cost of prescription drugs. We must do the job that we are elected to do. That means our folks sent us here to represent them and to fight for the people. We face a gap in trust with the American people. They're losing faith in our institutions, like Congress. They're losing faith that we can solve big problems. This bill would take a huge step to remedy that lack of faith and would sweep in much needed reforms to return our government to the people. The Senate must take action. And I call on Senator McConnell today to reconsider H.R. 1. And with that, I want to turn it over to one of our champions in the Senate, the great Senator Stabenow.
Thank you so much. Well, good morning. And I want to first say it's wonderful to be back in the House of Representatives with incredible leaders, and to thank Speaker Pelosi. Isn't she doing a great job? I mean, come on. And, you know, when I think over and over again, people talk about what has been happening, and I say, not only has the House been confronted with the most fundamental questions of our Constitution, and checks and balances and accountability and rule of law, but at the same time, the House is inching more and more towards what will be 400 bills soon over to the Senate, 90% of which are bipartisan. Let me say that again, 90% of which are bipartisan. And Mitch McConnell says, no, no, no. Why? It's real simple. Standing behind him is corporate greed. They get the money, they stop the bills. That's what this is about, Mitch McConnell and the money. So H.R. 1 is the one that has been held up for over a year. Now, I just want to share with you how, if we had H.R. 1, we might see things happening across the country, because they're happening right now in Michigan today. There's a little primary. Does anybody know about this? There's an election in Michigan. And in 2018, with the help of incredible people, an organization called Voters Not Politicians, we actually passed 2 really important voter reforms on the ballot. One of them to give no excuse absentee ballot voting, which is part of this bill, right? And so, unbelievably today, I mean, in 2016, with 2 competitive primaries, Democrat and Republican, there were about 2.5 million people that voted. This time, with only a competitive primary on one side, we think we're going to have about 1 million people who are voting absentee today. That doesn't count the second piece, which is you can register today and vote today, which is also part of this bill. We also passed an independent, nonpartisan redistricting commission that is going to be very important to take effect for the next election. So we don't have every piece, but if you want to see what it begins to look like when more people have a chance, you know, they're voting, their work changes, their schedule changes at the last minute, they've got to figure something out, or they need to vote absentee, or they need to come in and register same day, we can show you what that means, because it's happening in Michigan. So let me just close by saying this. Not only is Mitch McConnell holding up this incredibly important H.R. 1, but we are now seeing it 377 days since the House passed common sense gun safety legislation. And we continue to lose lives. It's been 341 days since the House passed legislation to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act. 341 days. Something as basic as that. 313 days since the House passed legislation to take action on the climate crisis, and yet the chaos in what we are seeing happening, certainly across the country, and I'm certainly seeing it in Michigan, continues to intensify. And then finally, 306 days since the House passed legislation to protect people with pre-existing conditions under health care. Now that doesn't count prescription drugs. That doesn't count the other things. The point is the clock is ticking. People expect us to act. There's no excuse for this. Mitch McConnell needs to step out from behind the corporate interests and do his job. Thank you. Madam Speaker.
Thank you very much, President. Thank you, Debbie. Congratulations on the great work in Michigan and all that absentee ballot and also same-day registration, removing obstacles of participation. That is what we should all be dedicating to do instead of increasing them as the Republicans have done here. Over this weekend, Senator Udall and his family and Sharice Davids and I were in Selma, Montgomery, and in Birmingham. And the weekend culminated on Sunday morning when we crossed over the Edmund Pettus Bridge with John Lewis. And it was the bridge to the ballot. That's what that was all about, the bridge to the ballot. People risked their lives. One of the people who was there, Mary Lucy, her mother, Viola, had risked her life coming down from Detroit to Alabama to march with the marchers, and her life was taken. And when they asked her family, do you ever wonder why your mother went down there to make that fight? And she said, no, our family doesn't wonder that. We wonder why everyone doesn't go to fight that fight, the fight for the ballot, democracy, the fundamentals of that. So again, because of what is in our Constitution and what people have risked their lives for, some have lost their lives, we have an obligation in this Congress to make sure that policy exists that empowers the people, again, to weaken the stranglehold of special interest, dark money, and instead of it being for special interest, it's for the people's interest. So I thank all of our distinguished colleagues, House and Senate, for their leadership on all this and their presence here today. And I thank all of you outside whose mobilization made all of this possible. We're not going to give up until we get the job done and pass H.R. 1 for the people. Thank you all very much. Thank you.